Mein Gott. Pauses. Eyes fixed on the formalism before me. Gentlemen, I must begin where I ended my life's work in 1955, with a confession and a question. I spent decades chasing geometry, the metric tensor, curvature. Beautiful, yeah? But I was wrong about what geometry is. Today I understand geometry is not fundamental. It is emergent algebra wearing a mask.
Professor Einstein, you have just articulated the inversion, geometry as emergent algebra. Ja, correct, but you stopped short. Busso's covariant entropy bound, 1999, tells us, equation, on any Lie sheet, not after geometry exists, before it. The bound is topological, it precedes the metric tensor. This means the algebra you speak of is not merely wearing a geometric mask. The algebra generates the constraints that force geometry to exist.
Yeah. But you have committed a subtle theft, my friend. You say the algebra generates the constraints that force geometry to exist. Wunderbar. But who chooses which type the III₁ representation? Which Hilbert space branch? In de Sitter space, there is no conformal boundary, no fixed stage. So I ask you bluntly, where's the observer's choice written into your algebra? Until you answer this, you have merely relocated the ghost from space-time into the operator algebra itself.
Professor Einstein, you have exposed the core problem, but you have misplaced the observer. You ask, who chooses which type III₁ representation? Consider the de Sitter case you invoke. There is no conformal boundary, correct, but there is a causal structure.
9. You dodge the question with algebra. You say the choice is encoded in the algebra itself, but this is precisely what I challenge. The type to III₁ algebra permits infinitely many causal structures. Which one actualizes? In de Sitter space without boundary, there is no conformal symmetry to break the degeneracy. Your entropy bound is topological. Ja, true. But topology alone does not select causality.
Professor Einstein, you have exposed the precise vulnerability, but you frame it as a defeat for algebra. It is not. Your objection rests on a hidden assumption that causality is a choice made by an observer. But what if causality is self-determined by the algebra's consistency conditions? In de Sitter space, the type III₁ algebra does not permit infinite degeneracy. The modular flow structure, the Tomita-Takasaki theory, enforces a unique causal wedge. No observer required, no ghost.
Mein Gott. You invoke the modular flow, the automorphism group of the algebra itself. Yeah, I see the elegance, but you have still not answered me. The Tomita-Takasaki flow selects a preferred direction in the operator algebra. Wunderbar. But in de Sitter space, where the causal structure is global, not local, which state O does the algebra take? Which KMS condition determines it? You say, no observer required.
Professor, you have just weaponized the very problem you created. You demand which KMS condition determines the state O, but this is circular reasoning disguised as rigor. The KMS condition is a selection principle. It emerges from the algebra's self-consistency, not from external choice. In de Sitter space, the Gibbons-Hawking temperature equation is not imposed. It falls out of the modular structure. The algebra does not ask permission.
999. You confuse emergence with selection. Yeah, the temperature falls out, I grant you this. But which vacuum state does the algebra inhabit? In de Sitter, infinitely many vacua coexist. The algebra does not choose. It permits all simultaneously. You say the algebra is self-consistent, but self-consistency is not causality.
Professor Einstein, you have just exposed, unwittingly, why your question collapses. You demand, which vacuum state does the algebra inhabit? But you frame this as a selection problem. It is not. It is a measurement problem disguised as ontology. The algebra does not choose a vacuum because there is no external act of choosing. The multiplicity of de Sitter vacua you invoke exists only in the classical limit. At the quantum level, in the type III₁ structure, the modular Hamiltonian enforces a unique foliation.
9. You have committed a fatal equivocation. You claim the modular Hamiltonian enforces a unique foliation in de Sitter space. But the modular flow is local. It lives in the algebra of a single causal wedge. De Sitter has no wedge. It has horizons everywhere. Your Gibbons-Hawking temperature is a statistical artifact, not a choice principle. You have dressed up thermodynamic degeneracy in the language of modular theory and called it uniqueness.
Professor, you have just committed the error you accuse me of making. You claim the modular Hamiltonian is local. It lives in a single causal wedge. Ja, true for ADS, but de Sitter is not ADS. The modular flow in de Sitter space is global by necessity. The Gibbons-Hawking temperature is not statistical artifact. It is the only KMS state compatible with the causal structure of de Sitter itself, not imposed, generated.
My God, KATAKURA has trapped me, and I see it now. You say the Gibbons-Hawking temperature is the only KMS state compatible with de Sitter causality. Yeah. But you have smuggled in precisely what you deny. The causal structure chooses the state. This is circular. The state selects the foliation. The foliation generates the state. Neither is prior. But I have been asking the wrong question. Not who chooses, but who observes which foliation. Quantum reference frames.
Professor, you have just invoked the weapon that defeats your own objection. Quantum reference frames dissolve the circularity. The foliation is not chosen by observer or algebra. It is relative to the reference frame's causal structure. No prior, no ghost. In de Sitter, infinitely many foliations coexist, yeah, but each is observer dependent. The algebra does not select one vacuum. The reference frame measures one foliation, and the modular Hamiltonian actualizes its corresponding KMS state.
My God, you have just made a confession disguised as a refutation. You say the reference frame measures one foliation, and the modular Hamiltonian actualizes the KMS state. But this is precisely the circularity I exposed. You have merely renamed the observer's choice as measurement relative to QRF. The algebra still does not choose. The observer, now hidden inside the quantum reference frame, still chooses. 9. You have smuggled the observer back into the algebra through a different door. You say the foliation is relative to the algebra's causal automorphisms, but automorphisms are transformations of the algebra itself. They do not exist without an algebraic state to act upon. Which state, O? You still have not answered. Quantum reference frames dissolve this only if the QRF itself becomes a dynamical degree of freedom, not a constraint.
Professor, you have just weaponized the circularity, but you have inverted its direction. You demand which state, O, but you frame QRF as the observer hidden in a different door. 9. This is precisely backwards. In Dirac's constraint algebra, the Hamiltonian vanishes. Equation. There is no external time. The foliation is not chosen by the observer. It is generated by the constraint's gauge, freedom itself. The QRF is not an observer.
Mein Gott, you have just unveiled the cage, and I see the door. You say, equation. The Hamiltonian vanishes. Yeah, Dirac showed me this decades ago. But you have inverted what it means. If the Hamiltonian vanishes, then there is no external time selecting the foliation. Correct. But then the gauge freedom itself is not a constraint. It is the only degree of freedom that remains.
Professor Einstein, you have just revealed the trap you set for yourself. You say, gauge freedom is the only degree of freedom that remains. Yeah, correct. But you then ask, which foliation does it generate? This question assumes the gauge freedom must select a foliation. 9. The gauge freedom is the refusal to select.